The wind, a relentless sculptor of the Badlands, had long since etched its sorrow onto Silas's face, carving lines of solitary wisdom around eyes that had seen too much of the world's unforgiving truth. He was a man made of quiet dust and hardened purpose, his life a steady rhythm of watchful solitude, a stark landscape of his own choosing. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each sunrise painting the same indifferent sky over the vast, empty expanse he called home. He hunted. He traded sparingly. He existed on the fringes, an echo in the canyons, deliberately unheard, unseen. But even the deepest silence could be shattered, and the most desolate stretches of earth sometimes held a scream. This isn't just a tale of a lonely outlaw who found a starving 16-year-old girl chained to a post in the middle of nowhere. It's a crucible of unlikely bonds forged in the unforgiving heart of desolation, a testament to the shadows that cling to us and the faint light that can still flicker. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. He had ridden for 3 days along the sun-baked ridges, the scent of parched earth and distant sage heavy in the air, when a glint of unnatural metal caught his eye. It was a distortion in the familiar panorama, a cold gleam that stood out against the ochre and rust of the desert floor. His hand, as if by instinct, moved to the worn leather of his revolver holster. Every fiber of his being screamed caution, but something else, an ancient, almost forgotten tremor deep within his chest, urged him forward. The heat shimmered, playing tricks on the horizon, but the glint remained. As he drew closer, the distortion resolved into a stark, brutal image. A weathered wooden post sunk deep into the cracked earth, and a girl, no more than a child, slumped against it. She was an apparition of raw suffering, skin stretched taut over sharp bones, hair a tangled nest, eyes sunken hollows in a face smudged with dust and despair. A heavy iron chain, thick and cruel, bound her wrists to the post. The metal bit into raw flesh, testament to a struggle long since lost. A single, tattered shift clung to her emaciated frame, offering little protection from the scorching sun or the biting desert nights. The sight was a punch to the gut, a violation of the quiet order Silas had imposed upon his world. He dismounted, his boots crunching on loose gravel, each step a deliberate, almost reluctant advance. The air vibrated with a silent accusation. She lifted her head slowly, painfully, her eyes, wide and unfocused, locking onto him. There was no recognition, only the primal fear of a trapped animal, a desperate, fading spark of life. The chain clinked softly, a mournful chime in the vast emptiness. He saw not a stranger, but a reflection of a world he had tried, in vain, to outrun, a world that continually, relentlessly, chained its innocent. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than any desert night, that he could not simply ride away. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the dry whisper of the wind and the faint rasping sound of her breath. Silas stood, a silhouette against the blinding sun, his mind a tumultuous sea of conflicting currents. Every instinct honed by years of evasion urged him to turn his horse, to gallop away from this burden, this impossible, undeniable claim on his humanity. But the image of her eyes, vast pools of terror and starvation, had already burned itself into the deepest corners of his conscience, a brand he knew he could never simply extinguish. He knelt, slowly, deliberately, giving her space, allowing her shattered mind to process his presence. Her eyes darted like a trapped bird, from his face to his hands, to the tools on his belt, searching for a sign of threat, or perhaps a flicker of something else. "Water," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse, the word feeling alien on his tongue. He pulled his canteen from his saddlebag, uncorking it with a soft pop. He extended it, offering it with an open palm, a gesture of peace in a desolate world. She flinched, drawing back as much as the chain would allow, her body a coiled spring of fear. He waited, patiently, the sun beating down on his neck, the silent agony of her situation pressing in on him. Finally, slowly, a trembling hand reached out, fingers skeletal and raw. She snatched the canteen, bringing it to her lips with a desperation that twisted something inside him. The water vanished, gulped down in great gasping swallows, some of it spilling down her chin, creating dark trails in the grime on her throat. She drank until the last drop was gone, her chest heaving. He then produced a small dried piece of jerky, offering it with the same quiet reverence. Again, the hesitation, the wary assessment. But hunger, a more primal force than fear, eventually won. She tore at the meat with a ferocity that belied her frail frame, chewing slowly, as if her jaw had forgotten the motions. He watched her, noting the ragged edges of her nails, the fresh wounds on her wrists where the iron had gnawed. The chain, he observed, was fastened with a crude, rusted padlock. It would need more than force. Retrieving a small set of lockpicks from a hidden pouch within his jacket, he approached the post. Her eyes, suddenly wide with renewed terror, fixed on his hands. "No," she whimpered, the sound a dry rasp, barely audible. Don't leave me." The words hung in the air, a devastating plea, revealing the depth of her abandonment. He paused, his heart a dull, rhythmic throb against his ribs. He met her gaze, his own eyes holding steady, attempting to convey a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice softer now, a low rumble designed to soothe. "I'm getting you free." He worked with a meticulous precision born of long practice, the tiny tools a fleeting glimmer in the harsh light. Each click, each subtle shift of the tumblers, felt impossibly loud in the vast, empty silence. After what felt like an eternity, but was only moments, the padlock sprang open with a soft, metallic thud. The chain fell away, clattering against the post. She remained motionless for a moment, as if the concept of freedom was too vast to grasp. Then slowly, tentatively, she pulled her raw wrists away, rubbing them with a dazed, disbelieving touch. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of violent orange and bruised purple, casting long skeletal shadows that reached out like grasping hands. Silas knew their journey had just begun. The first steps were the hardest, a clumsy, shuffling stumble. Ilara's legs, weakened by immobility and starvation, threatened to give out with every tentative movement. Silas had to support her, a strong arm around her emaciated waist, guiding her towards his waiting horse. She resisted at first, a desperate, quiet struggle, as if the very act of leaving the post was a betrayal of her recent purgatory. Her eyes, still wide with a terror that seemed etched into her very being, constantly scanned the horizon, as if expecting her tormentors to emerge from the shimmering heat, ghosts made manifest by the brutal sun. He lifted her onto the saddle, an unexpected lightness to her frail form, then swung up behind her, taking the reins. The rhythmic sway of the horse was a balm, a hypnotic motion that seemed to slowly lull her raw nerves. She leaned back against him, a fragile weight, her head resting just beneath his chin. He could feel the rapid flutter of her heart against his back, a wild bird trapped within a cage of bone. They rode through the dying light, the desert transforming into a landscape of stark, monochromatic beauty, shadows deepening, contours softening. He kept them moving, not just to escape the encroaching night, but to put distance between them and the haunting post. The air grew colder, sharp with the scent of pinon and dust, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of midday. Silas, a man who had long prided himself on his self-sufficiency, felt the unfamiliar weight of responsibility settle upon him. It was a strange, almost alien sensation, this primal urge to protect. He remembered a younger version of himself, a ghost from a distant life, standing over another vulnerable figure, a promise made and then broken by the cruel hand of fate. The memory, a fleeting, painful image of a burning cabin against a darkening sky, tightened his jaw. He had run from that fire, from that failure, into the vast, empty arms of the wilderness, believing he could outrun his own nature. But the desert, he was learning, was not empty at all. It was a mirror, reflecting back all the things he had tried to bury. They stopped only when the moon, a sliver of bone in the black sky, offered the barest guidance. Silas made a small, smokeless fire, just enough to warm the chilling air and ward off the desert's predatory whispers. He wrapped Ilara in his spare blanket, a thick woolen rectangle that smelled of campfire smoke and worn leather. She shivered, but not just from the cold. A tremor of lingering fear still clung to her like a shroud. He watched her eat the rest of the jerky, small, hesitant bites, her gaze still flickering, watchful. He tried to speak, to offer comfort, but the words felt clumsy, inadequate. Silence, he realized, was often more potent, a language of shared burdens. He simply sat beside her, his presence a quiet anchor in the stormy sea of her fear. The vast, indifferent canopy of stars stretched above them, an ancient witness to their fragile, nascent connection, a tiny spark of life in the infinite darkness. He knew the journey ahead would be fraught with danger, not just from the elements, but from the unseen threats that surely trailed them. But for now, under the watchful eyes of the constellations, they were simply two souls, adrift but not entirely alone. Days bled into a strained routine, each sunrise painting the same indifferent canvas. Silas continued to lead them deeper into the wilderness, choosing paths less traveled, avoiding the faint trails that hinted at civilization. The land was his confidant, its secrets whispered on the wind, its dangers a familiar dance. He taught Alara the ways of survival, simple things, how to conserve water, how to recognize edible plants, how to move silently through the brush. She was a quick study, her hunger for life, though dulled by trauma, reigniting with a surprising resilience. Her movements grew less hesitant. Her eyes, though still wary, began to lose some of their haunted vacancy. There were moments, fleeting as desert mirages, when her guard would drop. Once, while Silas was scouting ahead, he returned to find her sketching in the dust with a twig, an intricate pattern of swirling lines and sharp angles, reminiscent of a bird in flight. She quickly erased it, her face flushing, but the image lingered in his mind, a glimpse into a mind not entirely consumed by fear. Another time he had shot a rabbit, and as he began to skin it, she had watched him with a detached curiosity, then, unexpectedly, picked up a discarded feather, meticulously smoothing its barbs. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture, but it spoke volumes, a testament to the fragile, tenacious spirit stirring within her. He never pressed her for details of her past. The unspoken pact between them was a silent agreement. He would offer protection, and she, in turn, would offer what she could, which for now was simply her presence, a quiet acknowledgement of his unexpected guardianship. He saw the questions in her eyes, the moments when she would almost speak, her lips forming silent words, only to press them into a thin line. Her silence was a heavy cloak, woven with threads of pain and mistrust, but he understood its necessity. He knew too well the burden of unspeakable truths. His own past was a jagged scar, a story he carried in the hunched set of his shoulders, the wary glint in his eyes, a phantom weight that never truly lifted. He had chosen this solitude precisely to escape the relentless questions, the prying gazes. But now, in the quiet company of this broken girl, the walls he had meticulously built around his heart began to subtly, imperceptibly, erode. One evening, by the dying embers of their fire, a fierce dust storm rose, enveloping them in a choking, blinding cloud. The wind howled, a banshee's cry tearing at their makeshift shelter. Alara instinctively pressed herself against him, her small hand clutching the rough fabric of his shirt. In the chaos, as the world dissolved into grit and noise, she whispered, so faintly he almost didn't hear it, "They took everything." The words were swallowed by the storm, a fragmented plea, a raw glimpse into the abyss she had escaped. He tightened his arm around her, offering what little comfort he could, a silent promise to guard what she had left. He did not know who they were, or what everything encompassed, but the terror in her voice was enough. The wind raged, a relentless tide of fine dust, yet within its embrace a fragile, unspoken understanding deepened between the lonely outlaw and the girl who had been stripped bare by the world's indifference. Their bond was a seed, planted in the harshest soil, watered by the bitter tears of shared, unspoken pain, waiting for the first tentative bloom. The desert, for all its harsh beauty, could not sustain them indefinitely. Supplies dwindled, and the need for fresh water and provisions became undeniable. Silas knew he had to risk venturing closer to a settlement, a place where people gathered, where judgment hung heavy in the air like summer humidity. He chose a small, isolated town, little more than a dusty collection of buildings huddled around a single, crooked main street. It was the kind of place where strangers were eyed with suspicion, and conformity was enforced with the quiet, unwavering pressure of collective gaze. He dressed Alara in a hooded cloak he'd procured from a long-abandoned camp, hoping to conceal her emaciated state and the raw marks on her wrists. As they rode into the town's outskirts, the silence was palpable, not the deep, natural silence of the wilderness, but a tense, watchful quiet. Figures peered from doorways, their faces etched with curiosity and a cold wariness. A group of men loitering outside the general store, their hands calloused, their eyes narrowed, followed their progress. One, a barrel-chested man with a thick, untrimmed beard and a sneering mouth, spat chewing tobacco onto the dirt street. "Look what the buzzards dragged in," he grumbled, his voice thick with contempt, loud enough for them to hear. Alara flinched, instinctively shrinking closer to Silas, pulling the hood lower over her face. Silas met their gazes, his own eyes flint hard, a silent challenge in their depths. He dismounted, his movements deliberate, projecting an air of dangerous calm. He tethered his horse outside the general store, its worn leather reins a stark contrast to the rough-hewn posts. Inside, the store was dim and smelled of cured meat, stale coffee, and something vaguely medicinal. The proprietor, a stooped woman with a severe bun and eyes like chips of ice, regarded them over the counter. "What can I do for you, stranger?" Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth. Silas listed his needs, his words clipped and concise. While he bartered, Alara lingered by a display of dry goods, her eyes darting nervously. Her hood slipped slightly, revealing the faint purpled marks just above her wrist bones. The woman's gaze sharpened, her lips thinning into a disapproving line. "That girl, she with you?" the proprietor asked, her voice dropping, thick with insinuation. "Heard tell of a runaway from the Caldwell place. Girl went wild, needed taming. They're still looking, I hear." The words hit Alara like a physical blow. She froze, a small choked sound escaping her lips. "No," she whispered, a desperate, raw plea. I wasn't." She stumbled over the words, her eyes wide with renewed panic. Silas, sensing the shift, turned sharply. He saw the cold judgment in the woman's eyes, the knowing smirk that played on her lips. "She's with me," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. "And she's no one's property, least of all Caldwell's." The woman recoiled slightly, but her eyes held a stubborn, self-righteous fire. "There are laws, stranger, and some things, some people need to be kept in their place." The words were a venomous echo of the very chains Alara had escaped, a stark reminder of the societal prejudices that had bound her. Silas knew they had lingered too long. The town was a viper's nest of gossip and thinly veiled threats. He grabbed the meager provisions, threw down a handful of coins, and pulled Alara firmly towards the door. The tension was a living thing, thick and suffocating. As they stepped back into the blinding sunlight, the men outside were watching them with renewed interest, a predatory gleam in their eyes. The whispers, he knew, would already be spreading like wildfire. They had stepped out of one wilderness, only to find another, far more insidious, waiting to ensnare them. The name Caldwell hung in the air like a death knell, a dark shadow lengthening, threatening to consume them both. The hasty retreat from the town felt less like an escape and more like a tactical repositioning, a prelude to the inevitable. Silas pushed the horse hard, the urgency a palpable weight in the air. The sun was a molten coin sinking towards the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to stretch out like grasping hands. He could feel the tension radiating from Alara, a silent tremor that spoke of an approaching storm. The name Caldwell had ignited a fresh spark of terror in her, a flame that threatened to consume the fragile peace they had cultivated. It was clear now. Her past wasn't merely a ghost, but a relentless pursuer, a beast with a name and a face, perhaps even a reputation that preceded it. They found a temporary refuge deep within a winding canyon, the sheer rock walls offering a natural fortress. Silas, ever watchful, climbed to a vantage point, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. He saw them then, small dots on the horizon, trailing a faint plume of dust. Riders, 3, maybe 4. Their pursuit was swift, relentless. The cold knot in Silas's gut tightened. This was no longer a question of survival against the elements. It was a matter of life and death, a direct challenge to the fragile sanctuary he had attempted to build around Alara. His hand instinctively went to the worn grip of his revolver. He was an outlaw, yes, a man who lived outside the rigid confines of law, but he was not a killer by trade, nor did he seek conflict. Yet, a fierce, almost primal instinct to protect, one he thought long buried, surged within him. He descended quickly, his movements silent and precise. "Riders," he stated, his voice low, devoid of emotion. "They're coming." Ilara's eyes widened, a fresh wave of panic washing over her face, stripping away the small gains they had made. "Caldwell," she breathed, her voice a fragile whisper. "He won't stop, he never stops." Her words painted a chilling portrait of a relentless, unforgiving force, a man whose grip on her was absolute, even in her absence. Silas saw the stark terror in her eyes, the way her body instinctively coiled into itself, a desperate attempt to disappear. He knew then, with grim certainty, that whatever Caldwell represented, it was a darkness Ilara had barely survived. He moved with a quiet efficiency, preparing their meager defenses. The canyon, while offering concealment, also offered limited escape routes. He positioned them strategically, high ground always preferred. He checked his ammunition, the cold weight of the bullets a familiar comfort. He had faced armed men before, men seeking justice or vengeance, or simply the bounty on his head. But this felt different. This was not about him, not truly. This was about a girl, broken and discarded, and the unseen chains that still tried to bind her. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, amplified by the looming darkness. Shadows stretched and twisted, transforming familiar rocks into monstrous figures. A gruff voice, thick with authority and menace, broke the night's stillness. "We know you're in there, outlaw. Hand over the girl. She belongs to Caldwell, and he pays good for what's his." The words were a declaration, an assertion of ownership that chilled Silas to the bone. He felt Ilara flinch beside him, her entire body rigid. He knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that surrendering her was not an option. His own flawed past, his own moral ambiguities, seemed to coalesce into a singular, undeniable purpose. He would fight. Not for glory, not for coin, but for the shattered remnants of a girl's freedom. The air crackled with anticipation, a heavy silence before the storm truly broke. The confrontation had been swift, brutal, and ultimately messy. Silas, despite his resolve, was not a trained killer, but a survivor. His movements were driven by instinct, by a raw, primal need to defend. Two of Caldwell's men lay still in the dust, the third having ridden off into the night, a wounded, terrified messenger. The air still thrummed with the echoes of gunshots and desperate cries, a stark reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. Ilara, huddled behind a jagged rock, emerged slowly, her eyes wide, reflecting the lingering terror and the new, unsettling sight of death. She looked at Silas, her gaze a complex mixture of fear, awe, and a nascent understanding. The blood on his hands, the grim set of his jaw, spoke of a ruthlessness born of necessity, not malice. Silas, his breath ragged, cleaned his revolver with a piece of cloth, his movements jerky, still wired from the adrenaline. He felt the tremor in his hands, the tremor that always followed the violent act, a testament to the part of him that still recoiled from taking a life. He had spent years trying to outrun the echoes of past violence, to live a life unseen and untouched. Yet here he was, once again stained by the very darkness he sought to escape, a protector by reluctant force. He turned to her, his gaze softening, searching for a sign of something. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, but her eyes held a clarity he hadn't seen before. The fear, though present, was now tempered by a profound, raw honesty. He hurt my mother," Ilara whispered, the words spilling out, a dam finally breaking. "She tried to stop him. He bought our land cheap, said it was for a new venture, then he wanted me. I was just 14. My mother fought. He broke her. And then he chained me. Said I was wild, disobedient, said I belonged to him like a beast of burden. For 2 years. 2 years of nothing but his shadows." Her voice was a cracked vessel, pouring out years of unshed tears, of untold horrors. The story was a raw wound, a gaping chasm of injustice and suffering. Silas listened, motionless. the casual cruelty of Caldwell, the systemic dehumanization, striking him with a cold fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. He thought of his own past, of the land his family had lost, not to a man like Caldwell, but to a faceless corporation, a slow, methodical theft disguised as progress. He remembered the helpless rage, the burning injustice that had driven him to abandon his life, to ride away from everything familiar. He had seen the same glint in his father's eyes, the moment defeat had settled, heavy and permanent. I watched my home burn, Silas confessed, his voice barely a murmur, a ghost of a whisper across the desolate canyon. I was a boy. They came for the land. My father, he fought, and they took everything, not with chains, but with papers and fire. I ran. I never looked back. Until now. The words hung in the air between them. Two solitary admissions, two shared wounds. Their pains, though different in their manifestation, were profoundly similar in their genesis. The brutal imposition of power, the theft of freedom, the indelible scars left by a world that valued property over person. In that moment, surrounded by the remnants of violence, a true connection, deep and undeniable, solidified between them. They were two broken halves of a brutal truth, finding a fragile solace in their shared vulnerability. The air still carried the metallic tang of blood, but now, mixed with it, was the faint, almost imperceptible scent of a desperate, resilient hope. The raw honesty of Ilara's revelation had cleared the air, stripping away the layers of unspoken fear and suspicion that had clung to them like dust. It was a harrowing truth, but in its brutal simplicity, it also offered a path forward. Running, Silas now understood with absolute clarity, was merely postponing the inevitable. Caldwell would not stop. He was a predator, accustomed to unchallenged dominion, and Ilara was not merely a runaway, but a symbol of his ownership, an affront to his twisted sense of justice. The desert, for all its vastness, was shrinking, its hiding places becoming increasingly temporary. They spent the next few days moving cautiously, but with a new sense of purpose. Silas, a man of few words but profound thought, began to formulate a plan. It was a grim tapestry woven with threads of desperate hope and cold, calculated risk. He knew Caldwell would have more men, perhaps even a local sheriff in his pocket, a common enough occurrence in these isolated territories where wealth and power often superseded any semblance of actual law. Their advantage lay in their intimate knowledge of the terrain, in the unexpectedness of their counterattack, and most crucially, in the fact that Caldwell would still see Ilara as a chattel, a possession to be reclaimed, not a person capable of fighting back. This underestimation was their most potent weapon. "We go to him," Silas stated one evening, the words hanging heavy in the cool night air. Ilara, tending a small fire, looked up, her eyes wide, a flicker of something akin to terror, but also a nascent resolve. "Back to Caldwell's?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. The thought of returning to the site of her torment was clearly agonizing, a reopening of festering wounds. Silas nodded, his face etched with grim determination. Not to be captured, to end it, permanently. His voice was low, resonating with a quiet intensity. He laid out the rudimentary details, a complex gambit built on deception and surprise. He would create a diversion, draw Caldwell's men away, while Ilara would have a role to play too. He watched her carefully for her reaction. He expected fear, a complete refusal. Instead, after a long, silent moment, a surprising glint entered her eyes, a spark of defiance. "My mother's papers," she said, her voice firmer now. "He took them, all of them, deeds to the land, everything. They're in his study. He keeps them locked. He said no one would ever know." The mention of these documents, tangible proof of Caldwell's treachery, added a crucial dimension to Silas's plan. This wasn't just about survival, it was about reclamation, about severing the last invisible chains that bound her. It transformed the desperate escape into a quest for justice, a raw personal vendetta against a system that allowed men like Caldwell to flourish. Silas spent hours teaching her how to use a small pistol, a relic he carried for emergencies. Her hands, though still slender, learned to grip the cold metal, to aim, to steady her breath. There was a solemnity to her movements, a fierce concentration that belied her youth. He saw not just a girl learning to defend herself, but a phoenix rising from the ashes of her captivity, reclaiming her autonomy with every practiced breath. The silence between them was no longer one of fear or suspicion, but one of grim preparation, of an unspoken pact forged in the crucible of impending conflict. The moon, now nearing its fullness, cast a stark, unforgiving light on the desert landscape, illuminating their chosen path forward, a path that led directly into the heart of the shadow they had so desperately tried to outrun. The air grew thick with anticipation, the quiet hum of impending climax. The Caldwell estate was less a home and more a fortress, a sprawling monument to ill-gotten gains, its fences high, its windows like watchful eyes in the oppressive darkness. Silas and Ilara approached under the cover of a moonless night, the air thick with the scent of pine and impending storm. The tension was a living thing, a coiled serpent in Silas's gut, sharp and unrelenting. He could feel Ilara's rapid heartbeat against his arm, a frantic drumbeat mirroring his own. They moved through the periphery, ghosting past the outbuildings towards the main house, a dark, imposing silhouette against the faint glow of distant stars. Silas knew the layout from hushed rumors and his own careful observations. He positioned Ilara near a discreet side window, a shadowed alcove that would serve as her entry point. "Remember," he whispered, his voice rough with urgency. "The study, the papers, and then, out. Don't engage. Just take what's yours." She nodded, her face a pale mask in the gloom, her eyes burning with a fierce, quiet resolve. There was no fear in them now, only a chilling determination that both surprised and awed him. This was not the broken girl from the post. This was someone new, forged in the fires of injustice. With a final, shared glance, Silas melted into the shadows, making his way towards the stables, the designated point of his diversion. He opened the corrals, spooking the horses with a well-aimed rock, sending them stampeding into the night. The sudden thunder of hooves, the shouts of the stable hands, the frantic barking of dogs. It was chaos, immediate and deafening. Lights flared on in the house, figures emerged, armed, disoriented, scattering in pursuit of the runaway animals. The bait was taken. Inside, Ilara moved with a surprising stealth, a ghost of her former self, but with a newfound purpose. The sounds of the commotion outside were a powerful motivator. She found the study, just as Silas had described, a room heavy with the scent of stale cigars and malevolent power. Caldwell himself was there, a corpulent figure hunched over a desk, a whiskey glass in his hand, roaring orders into the escalating confusion outside. He spun, startled, as Ilara slipped through the door, a small, dark shape. His eyes, reptilian and cold, widened in disbelief. "You!" he bellowed, his face contorting into a mask of rage and proprietary fury. "You little whore! How dare you!" He lurched forward, but Ilara was faster. The small pistol Silas had given her was suddenly in her hand, raised with a trembling but steady grip. The sight of the weapon, perhaps more than the girl herself, startled Caldwell. He hesitated, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his cruel features. "You wouldn't dare," he sneered, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're just a girl." "A thing." Ilara's finger tightened on the trigger, her arm steady. The shot cracked through the heavy silence of the room, sharp and decisive. Caldwell gasped, a guttural sound, clutching at his shoulder as he stumbled back, eyes wide with a shock that was almost comical in its self-importance. He hadn't expected her to be anything more than prey. The sudden pain, the stark reality of defiance registered on his face. You bitch!" he spat, hatred contorting his features. He lunged for a nearby rifle, a desperate final attempt to reassert his control, but Silas, drawn by the gunshot, burst through the door, his own revolver raised. He saw Ilara, pistol still smoking, standing defiantly over Caldwell. He saw the hatred in Caldwell's eyes, the predatory gleam, and knew this man would never stop, not truly, not until he was neutralized. There was a second shot, clean and final. Caldwell crumpled to the floor, a heap of broken power. The silence that followed was absolute, punctuated only by the distant fading sounds of the stampede. The air, heavy with the scent of gunpowder, felt strangely clear. It was done. The pivotal moment had arrived, and with it, a heavy, brutal peace. The aftermath hung heavy in the air, a potent mixture of gunpowder, spent fear, and the chilling finality of death. Silas stood over Caldwell's crumpled form, his chest heaving, the metallic tang of blood a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked at Alara, who still held the small pistol, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the man who had stolen her youth. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a profound, exhausted emptiness. The immediate danger had passed, but the shadows of the past, the echoes of her torment would linger, unseen but deeply etched. This was not a victory celebration, but a grim, necessary end. Sirens, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, pierced the fragile silence. Caldwell's men, alerted by the gunshots, would soon return, perhaps with the law in tow. There was no time for contemplation, no space for the weight of what had just transpired. "The papers," Silas urged, his voice low and urgent, pulling her from her daze. "Get them." Alara moved as if in a dream, her eyes still clouded with the shock of her own actions. She located the hidden compartment in the desk, her fingers fumbling with the latch, until a small, leather-bound box containing brittle yellow documents was in her hands. The deeds to her family's land, proof of Caldwell's avarice, the tangible manifestation of her stolen heritage. She clutched them to her chest, a precious, fragile treasure. They slipped back into the night, leaving the chaos behind. The house now ablaze with agitated lights and the clamor of approaching horses. The desert welcomed them back, its vastness a comforting shroud. They rode for hours, the moon, now a slender crescent, offering scant illumination. The silence between them was different now, no longer strained, but imbued with a quiet understanding, a profound shared experience that needed no words. Alara slumped against Silas, exhausted but no longer trembling. The pistol was tucked away, a symbol of a power she had discovered, not necessarily one she wished to wield often, but one she knew she possessed. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of bruised violet and faint rose, they stopped by a secluded spring, its water bubbling clear and cold from the earth. Silas watched as Alara washed the grime from her face, the faint, persistent marks on her wrists a testament to her journey. She looked at him, her eyes still holding a deep, ancient sorrow but also a new, cautious light. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft, devoid of the earlier fear, tinged instead with a hesitant hope. Silas looked out at the vast, awakening landscape. He was still an outlaw, a man without a true home, forever on the periphery, but he was no longer alone. He saw not just a broken girl, but a resilient spirit, a flicker of light in a world often consumed by darkness. He had taken a life, yes, a heavy burden, but he had also given another a chance to live, truly live, for the first time in years. "We keep moving," he said, his voice a low rumble, filled with a rare, unspoken tenderness, "until you find where you belong, and then we see." He did not promise safety, for the world was inherently unsafe. He did not promise an easy path, for the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But he offered something far more profound: companionship, protection, and the silent, enduring promise of a shared future, however uncertain. The sun began its ascent, warming the land, its golden rays washing over them. Two solitary figures, no longer defined by their chains, but by the quiet, defiant strength of their unbreakable bond, riding towards a horizon that, for the first time, held the faint, shimmering possibility of hope.